Hello again. I was on the Firefox and it wasn't working, so I have to do it on Chrome. Sorry. So apparently everything should be okay now. Sound is on. Welcome, everybody. I will repeat what I just said earlier. It was so lovely. This is my second broadcast and live streaming, and I'm a bit more relaxed today. Got the opening thing wrong. Sound should be okay now. Welcome all. Thank you, Audrey and Sonic. Hey, so many lovely people. I feel you're all here with me. We could be round a fire at a festival, all sharing together. And this is the world that we're in at the moment. And it's so lovely. I'm very touched. So, hi, I am Mathura Das. This broadcast is coming from the southwest of London, and I'm going to do them regularly. I'm going to start off with the 3 Oms that you can join in with me, and then I'm going to do some mantra, Shri Krishna Govinda Hari Murari, Hey Nata Narayana Vasudeva, which is going to change halfway through into Om Namo Narayana. And then, due to the request of Pratik, he wanted me to do O India, and after I've done that, I'm going to go off on a bit of a waffle and a talk and a story, and I know you all like stories, so thank you very much. Please, it's an honor. It's lovely to share with you. Hari Om. Just turn up the drone a bit. Hi Sandipan, it's lovely to see people from Calcutta joining in. Sandipan is a lovely musician. I've been checking his music out recently. Hare Krishna. This is my own composition, Shri Krishna Govinda Hari Murari, and then it's going to change into Om Namo Narayana, and it's going to be kind of question and response. You can just sing at home along with me. Thank you. We have to imagine that there's a tabla here and some lovely shakers, and it's going da din din 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 da. Krishna Govinda Hare Murari, Shri Krishna Govinda Hare Murari, Shri Krishna Govinda Hare Murari, Shri Krishna Govinda Hare Murari. He Nata Narayana Vasudeva, He Nata Narayana Vasudeva, Shri Krishna Govinda Hare Murari, Shri Krishna Govinda Hare Murari, He Nata Narayana Vasudeva, He Nata Narayana Vasudeva, Shri Krishna Govinda Hare Murari, Shri Krishna Govinda Hare Murari, He Narayana Vasudeva, He Nata Narayana Vasudeva, Shri Krishna Govinda Hare Murari, Shri Krishna Govinda Hare Murari, He Nata Narayana Vasudeva, He Nata Narayana Vasudeva, Shri Krishna Govinda Hare Murari, Shri Krishna Govinda Hare Murari, He Nata Narayana Vasudeva, He Nata Narayana Vasudeva. Shri Krishna Govinda Hare Murari, Shri Krishna Govinda Hare Murari, He Nata Narayana Vasudeva, He Nata Narayana Vasudeva, Shri Krishna Govinda Hare Murari, Shri Krishna Govinda Hare Murari, Narayana Vasudeva, Ekata Narayana Vasudeva, Shri Krishna Govinda Hare Murari, Shri Krishna Govinda Hare Murari, Ekata Narayana Vasudeva, Ekata Narayana Vasudeva. Narayan, Narayan, Narayan. Hari Om, Hari Om, Hari Om. 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 Hari Om. Lakshmi Narayana 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 Lakshmi Narayana 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 Shanti, 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 Hari. Everybody. Narayan. So the story goes that Sri Ramanuja Acharya, one of the great Vaishnava acharyas from the 11th century South India, apparently when he was given this mantra, Om Namo Narayana, his guru says, be careful, because if you give this out, it can liberate anybody, and you have to be careful. It was a bit touchy in those days to give out mantras to everybody. And the first thing he did apparently was go up to a very high pillar or a building and shout out the mantra to everybody. He completely went against his guru's instructions and shouted it out to everybody. So, Om Namo Narayana, that is the main mantra of Sri Vaishnava Sampradaya, Hari Om. If you go to the main Vishnu temples in South India, Sri Rangam specifically, which is the headquarters, you could say, of the Ramanuja Sampradaya. Sampradayas are lineages, and they go back to the beginning of time, but in a more modern era, you could say, certain acharyas, great teachers, have become the main prominent. They have given schools of thought, interpretations to the Vedas, because every aspect of Sanatana Dharma, or what is popularly known as Hinduism, has its roots in some aspect of what an umbrella term that's used, a Vedic culture. And there's so many branches and lineages and sub-branches and aspects to the whole of Hinduism. I'm not going to talk about that now, but that there are lineages and sampradayas, and Ramanujacharya is the founder, Acharya of, well, he's not the founder Acharya. His guru was Jamuna Acharya, and there are many other Acharyas, but he was the most prominent. And the way that you really become a prominent Acharya, because it means you have to be an authority. And to be an authority in India means you have to know the scriptures, the Shastras, and you have to understand them. You have to not only just be a spiritual adept, but you have to have vast intellectual acumen and be a vidwan, a great ocean of knowledge. And of the Vedic texts, the most highfalutin is the Vedanta sutras, which are short little aphorisms with condensed meanings. And all the great acharyas in modern times, Shankaracharya from the 8th century, he wrote his commentary on the Vedanta Sutras. They're called bhasyas. And every bhasya commentary has a siddhanta. And a siddhanta is a summing up. It's a summing up of the whole of the philosophy. So you may come to me and say, hey, Mathura, what's your trip, man? And I might say, if I was follower Shankara, I go, it's all one. That's what's popular, and a lot of people know, it's quite popular these days. It's called Advaita. There's all sorts of neo-Advaita schools. Absolute monism in the West, it would be called. Kevalya Advaita is the school of Shankara. And he appeared in the 8th century, and his commentaries on Vedanta and Vedic texts were so powerful and influential that actually they were one of the main reasons why Buddhism that was very prevalent had grown to be very large in India. It kind of started to spread more and leave India, lots to do with the influence of Shankaracharya. And Ramanuja appeared in the 11th century, and he countered the interpretation of Vedanta and Vedic texts of Shankara. And his Siddhanta conclusion was called Vashisht Advaita, which means qualified oneness. I will sing a song one day, maybe tomorrow or later, about this oneness and manyness. But what I'm going to do now is get a little bit lighter and sing a song that's Pratik, who is in Bombay, lovely friend of mine, beautiful man, who I met actually online, being a customer of 3. I shouldn't actually say that, but we became friends online. He was at a call center, and we've been friends since then, and Darren as well, and he's wonderful, and so his family. And he has requested that I sing "O India." "O India" is if anybody wasn't watching yesterday, I have a musical partnership in a group called the Bindu Babas with my dearly beloved friend Pranaji, who is not here, unfortunately. And we wrote many songs. We performed in England through the festivals, in the festival circuit, the Green Gathering, Buddha Field, and other gatherings of such type. And while we were in India, we wrote this song. I came up with a riff. I was very into Latin music. I'd seen Buena Vista Social Club, and I was experimenting with Latin chords and changes. And I had a riff, and Prana said, "What are you doing with that?" And I said, "I don't know." And he said, "Keep playing it." And I kept playing this riff, and he came up with the first line, which is, "Gather round and hear my story." So that's how we started writing this song, and we performed it first live in the Kana Nirvana Cafe in Dharamshala. And I have to say, up until then, I was extremely nervous about gigging. You wouldn't think it. You'd think, my God, Mathura nervous? No, but I was very, very nervous, shy. Prana was born to perform. He'd been performing his whole life, writing songs, busking all over the place. But it was new for me. And we performed this song with some other songs. And we got such an amazing response, and the crowd went wild, that I stopped my whole freak out and nervousness about performing. And one girl who was there came up to me and said it was the first time hearing our gig and our song that she'd been very depressed, and it gave her happiness. And it was quite an amazing reaction to get from just a song that you sit and find interesting. Now, this song, India is a big subject, isn't it? It's massive. And many people watching today are either from India, have been to India, influenced by Indian ideas, the food, the culture. In one way, a lot of people are in love with India. And in 1996, my life started to get unusual. There was all sorts of energies I detected in my universe, in my world, that were beginning to rise. And I had a bit of a Kundalini thing. Many people have Kundalini things. Nikki Slade describes her Kundalini story in her very interesting book. Nikki Slade is a very well-known kirtan singer from England. She teaches kirtan, and she's got a great book. And Stanislav Grof, the great psychologist, his wife Christina had uncontrollable Kundalini experiences. But that's another subject. But what happened was I met this very, very interesting person, a Baba, not a celibate renunciate, but a married man. Used to be a chemistry professor from Bihar. And I met him in Varanasi. And I had extraordinary experiences from him through a system that's quite well known, talked about in different spiritual circles in India, called Shaktipad. Shakti means energy, Pad means kind of transference. And different teachers and gurus who are connected with this kind of system, there's a form of transmission of Shakti that comes in different ways. Some great teachers like Anandamoy Ma, people would just be in her presence and she would just exude spiritual energy and people would go into experience all sorts of things. This experience that I had was a touching of my thumbs by Ranjit Nath. It's a long, detailed story. I might go into it after I've sung this song. And it's about meeting him, but before that also being in Bengal and meeting a Sikh who told about all sorts of things as an astrologer. And please feel free to join in the chorus. Okay, for those of you who know it, it's called Oh India, written by me and Prana, and I hope you enjoy it. Okay. I do these funny noises with my mouth. Some people call it the rubber trumpet because I don't have any instrumentalist or a saxophone player here. Prana does it much better than me. He can do trumpets, saxophones, and trombones all with his mouth. And I just sound a bit like a headless chicken. But anyway, here we go. Gather round and hear my story, tales intriguing from afar, how I lost my heart completely in the land called India. On a sweet breeze I went sailing to this land of ancient kings, spun the wheel to seek my fortune, for who knows what tomorrow brings. Camels and cows and rickshaws everywhere, and bright-eyed girls with flowers in their hair, sitting on the corner with your patties and rice. Pay the dahiwala for a lassie and ice. Porter took my bags to the hotel room. Baba said he'd see me in the afternoon. When Baba came to see me through his pan-stained teeth, he said, "It's your lucky day. We got some Mazari Sharif." Oh, India, you'll always be my love affair. There's never been a jewel so rare. There's no one like you anywhere. Oh, India, yes, you're the only one for me. I'm as high as I could ever be, and only 50 quid a key. In the wilds of West Bengal, I met a psychic Sikh called Singh. With just one look and in an instant, he could tell me everything. Something big was gonna happen after I turned 43. Unifying mystic forces would reveal my destiny. Took an AC sleeper down to Varanasi, smoked a wicked chillum, drinking spicy chai tea, sitting by the Ganges after taking my bath. And when I looked around, there was this Ranjit man, a Baba dressed in black and all covered in ash, hypnotic eyes and garlanded with Shiva Rudraksh. I was taken by surprise, I didn't know what to do. He said, "Welcome, my friend, I've been expecting you." Oh, India, you'll always be my love affair. There's never been a jewel so rare. I think we'd make a lovely pair. Oh, India, yes, you're the only one for me. Sat on my mat under this banyan tree, as happy as can be. Went back to this fellow's dooney, where we sat for for quite a while, revealed his deepest secrets to me, passed down through the hands of time. He seemed to touch something inside me, a wave of light engulfed my soul. I took a transcendental journey, the greatest story yet untold. Kundalini rising like my spine was on fire, sucked into a vortex passing through my third eye. Chakras started spinning, they all started to ring, and then I watched the heavens open and I saw everything. Past, present and future all rolled into one. Endless lives and visions, all that I've ever done. God handed me the script, and as I turned the first page, I was looking at the dawning of a new golden age. Oh, India, you'll always be my love affair. There's never been a jewel so rare. There's no one like you anywhere. Oh, India, yes, you're the only one for me. I wonder what my next door neighbours would say if I took you home to mum for tea. Bharat Mata Ki Jai. Hope you enjoyed that. So yes, that's one of the strange things that can happen to anybody in India, but it does happen a lot to a few foreigners. I know they've had all sorts of strange experiences, and that's what's happened to me. And okay, I've been this has been going for about half an hour now. I'm going to talk for a little bit because that's what I plan to do with these presentations. I like talking, as you gathered, and apparently people like hearing what I have to say. Everyone likes a story, don't they, really? So in 2005 my mother passed away, and I took up residence in a lovely beautiful place in Mussoorie, which is in the Himalayas, not far from Rishikesh. It's an old British Raj hill station, and I had the good fortune to stay with a very interesting gentleman, Sudhir Taplial, and there was Ratan in the house and Satish. It was a family living in this big old British bungalow, built in 1840 in 20 acres of forest. South of the Mall in Mussoorie, which is the top part of the ridge at 6,000 feet and overlooking Dehradun, which is now the capital of the new state of Uttaranchal that was created a few years ago, which goes from Haridwar up to the Himalayas. So while I was sitting there, I had, it was a big thing. I turned 50, my mother had passed away, and I'd been traveling in India since 76, and I needed to sit somewhere and reflect on life. A big chapter in my life had finished, and then I started to think about why am I like I am? How did I get my name? And as I mentioned yesterday, this kind of talk is based upon a simple, the simple essence of my talk is, what is in a name? How did I get the name Mathura Das? There's a lot of foreigners with Indian names. There's a kind of an issue amongst certain people about a cultural misappropriation, or people taking other people's cultures and trivializing them. But there can be an issue with that. But this is the story about people like myself who, I'm 63 now, and some amazing things happened to me in my teens, late teens. And they were so powerful and influential that I decided not to go to art college, do a foundation course in England, and actually to leave everything and go off and join an ashram. And even in India, I think most kind of parents would be a bit horrified if their 16-year-old son decided to say, no, mum, I don't want to study. No, dad, I just want to go off and live in an ashram. They would be freaked out. But my lovely parents, my mother, even though it was a big shock for them because my mum was an agnostic and my father of Jewish stock, but a complete atheist, we didn't have any mention of God in our house. This shocks quite a few people because a lot of people in the world, they are born with religion, and religion is, they can't imagine that somebody can not have a religion. But I'm just going to move myself, that light. Hold on a second. Okay. Excuse me. And that light was shining. It's still shining in my eyes. But, okay. Sorry about the reflection in my glass. There's nothing I can do about it at the moment. So I had a lot of time to think about life and think about and I'm very interested in historical processes, and nothing just comes from nowhere, really, you know. Okay, so say if I'm traveling on a train in India and I'm not dressed specifically in a kurta, I've got a moustache, I don't have a tilak marking on my forehead, I'm not overtly a Krishna devotee, and so I'm traveling on a train. And somebody will say, excuse me, what is your good name, please? And I will go, Mathura Das. And they often go, what? What? How did you get this name? Because apparently there was a film made in India a few years ago about the battle between India and Pakistan, and one of the heroes is called Mathura Das. So in India, he's the most kind of famous Mathura Das that's been in India. But funnily enough, my landlord Sudhir and his friends were all sitting around with their whiskey one evening, having a laugh about all the different Mathura Dases, and they were all going, "Oh, do you remember Mathura Das up there, the Panwala? Yeah, he was a nice guy, and that Mathura Das." So it's quite a common name in India. But me, I'm from a middle-class family, southwest London, born in 1956, and I got this name in 1974. Now, it's not on my passport, but it's the name that most people know me by, and I've identified with this name of mine, even though I was born Mark, and I have a middle name called William, which is what they call me at work. But actually, I am Mathura Das. So I want to tell you a story, because I've been thinking about this a lot, and it's kind of eventually what I would like to do is travel and talk and do what I'm kind of doing in these presentations, is talking about things and giving a song, some chants, and explaining this interest of mine, because it's a phenomena that affects millions and millions of people on the world, and a lot of people don't really understand the background behind things. I always, because I focus on this subject and it's kind of my thing, really, it's my expertise in this field. I kind of, one can often assume that everybody else knows what one does know. So I'm not going to assume, as I'm speaking to a very large audience, many of the things that I might talk people going, oh yeah, I know all that, kind of move on. But I'm going to not spend too much time on everything, but give a kind of, I'll try and put a big story into a short amount of time as possible. And I'm not going to explain everything today. I'm going to talk for as long as I can talk, and then I'm just going to continue the talk another day, because there's a lot to tell. Okay. Now, when I've asked those people on the train in India, have asked me, and I've told them Mathura Das, the second thing they ask is they look at me and they go, and I explain. I said, I can give a very simple explanation. My guru gave me this name. That's the one sentence answer to where I got the name Mathura Das. They'll go, and then they'll look at me and they'll go, and now, are you still part of this Hare Krishna organization or movement? And I will go, no, actually, I'm freelance. I'm independent. And they'll go, oh, why? So that's the second part of my story that I wrote. My first part of my story is, how did I get the name Mathura Das, and what actually happened when I got that name? And the question is, my journey with the Krishna institution, not the movement, but the institution, came to an end in 1980. from 1973 to 1980, I was a full-time member of the Hare Krishna movement, but I've been kind of freelance since then. So people might want to know. So that's a long way down the line, that story. I'm going to give you now an introduction to a story which is explains not just me, how I got the name Mathura Das, and Krishna orientated. It's actually a story of a subgroup of the baby boom generation. Basically, that's the end. You could say the story that I'm directly involved with, and that story is a story of the subgroup is a group of people that in the 60s went on a journey, and the two kind of like major influence, one of the major influences, or I could say the major influence that had on this subgroup to get involved with Indian, specifically spirituality, was the role of psychedelics in the 60s and the 70s. This had a huge influence on millions of people, and not everybody reacted in the same way, but quite a lot of people did. And I'm going to explain that story about that includes that subgroup and how many people, because not only Hare Krishna gurus give Indian names to their disciples, there's so many gurus that have come from India and have students, and people have changed their names, and that's part of this story. Okay, so here we go. Okay, now the bigger picture, that in terms of how I became Mathura Das, there are two stories that coalesced in my life, and you could say collided and created who I am. One is the psychedelic story, and I call it the ripple effect. Okay, because psychedelic, paradigm shifts and movements and ideas can start with literally one person or a group of people and spread out like ripples and have influences immediately, and they can be influenced over thousands of years. Look at Jesus and Buddha and Krishna, and this is so. The psychedelic story in the modern day story is more of a contemporary story, but the Krishna story starts once upon a time, long ago. Okay, now that is part of the story that comes down from thousands of years in India, and reaches us in the modern period, you could say during the time of the British, in the mid 18th century, and then gradually it comes down in terms of it comes down to the 20th century, and then it comes to the West, and that's where my involvement in the story becomes. But one has to backtrack a little bit just so that one understands a little bit about the world, because many people in India also may not be understanding actually how this all kind of east-west connection with the spirituality kind of came about. So if you can imagine the geography of the planet, England is just this small little country over there in the North Sea, and there's this massive Europe and Russia, and then there's South America and North America and Africa, and then over in the east we get through to the Middle East, and then we get India, and before 1947, India included Pakistan and Bangladesh, and before that, it actually included Afghanistan and Burma, and it includes all the other eastern states, and the culture that came from India spread as far as Cambodia, Indonesia, and it was a very important culture. So, but if one would go back to, say, Elizabethan England or pre-Elizabethan England, not many people in Europe really knew about India. Not many people had traveled. Nobody really understood about it. And the power that when one looks at world history, one generally focuses on the European influence on world history, not to neglect what was going on in the world, but I'm going to focus on that aspect of the story because that involves India specifically. And the identity, okay, because we're talking about people that are in England that are get influenced by this whatever's coming from this world over there, this mysterious world that is from India. What's going on here? So gradually, in Europe, people in England started to become more and more aware of other cultures, and these cultures started to seep into England. We'd already had the Romans, and with their culture, they left remnants of it. Then we had the Angles and the Saxons, and then we had in 1066 we had the French. So you look at English language, there's lots of French, and there's all of these different things, and all these different influences coming in. And then around, I think 17th century, may have been earlier, rich young men from Europe, especially England, they used to go on what is called a tour of Greece and the ancient world. And this way, they got very influenced by the styles and the culture of a culture that was not British. But the British, the religion of Christianity, it started in the Middle East, and it got translated, and the whole kind of culture of that was in Latin, and the center of that was in Rome, in Italy as well. So a few people in Europe, they got influenced by that. And then gradually, as Europe started to expand and their boats and their naval fleets got more and more proficient in traversing the waves and covering all these long distances from Europe to India. The Spanish and the Portuguese were kind of first on it. They were kind of the big guns in Europe at that time. They arrived in different parts of India, got settled in Goa, and at that time, India was being run by the Mughals, and with their center in Delhi and in Agra. So the Mughal emperor was based there, and they had all sorts of different deals, the Europeans with the Indians, about what they were doing there. It was all about business and trade, really. Amongst all of that, there were intellectuals and people, and of course, they were trying to explain the Catholic religion to the Mughals and the culture. And certain things were shared, and some of the intellectuals got interested in some of the ideas behind what that were coming from India, but it was a minority. Okay, the next big step really was when there was the Dutch and the French. They were all there, the Portuguese, the Spanish, and all different parts of India, and all getting involved in India in various ways. And England, its own story and how it's influenced the world and the British Empire, started to get established more and more and more in India, basically. And then around the 18th century, and Calcutta, specifically, it's very important this. Calcutta was a trading port that had been very, very small before, more than, say, Bombay and Madras, that were trading centers. Calcutta was a trading center, but it became the capital of this. Well, first of all, it was the East India Company before actually the royal throne. Queen Victoria was, I think, pronounced Empress of India in 1860. Took a while for that, but the influence of the British was very, very big, and Calcutta became one of the second biggest cities in the British Empire at that time. Now, during this period in India, there was a class of Indians. Basically, they were called, in Bengal, they were called Badralok. They were like the kind of upper middle classes of India, and to survive, you could say, in this new culture that was being set up by the British in Calcutta, many of the British actually set up educational institutions in Calcutta to educate a class. They wanted a class of Indians that could run India for them, because there was just a handful of these Brits controlling millions of Indians. It's a mirror. It's amazing. People often wonder how this was possible, and it is quite a strange phenomenon how they managed to do that. But one of the ways that they planned to do that was to build these institutions, these educational institutions. And in those institutions, classes of Bengalis went from their villages, or they were already in Calcutta, and they started to become aware and educated in the British language, English language, really. And they became aware of Socrates and Plato, the Bible, Shakespeare, Milton, all these great thinkers from the West. They became aware. Their whole vision and perspective on the world enlarged. They had a much larger an international perspective on the nature of life, really. And the story that I'm connected to is very much influenced by one specific person who was called Kedaranath Dutt. Okay, now Kedaranath Dutt, he came to Calcutta he was born about 1835 and then came in his 20s to Calcutta about 1850 and became educated. And at that time, he befriended some very famous people that you may be aware of. You may have heard of Rabindranath Tagore, a great poet. His elder brother, they were also very well educated in the British system. Now, this class of Bengalis, they were very, very. The British at that time were trying to. Well, their mode of operation was to actually kind of preach or explain to the Bengalis and the Indians that they were inferior, their culture was inferior, that the superior religion of Christianity and of the Greek culture, the ancient Greek culture, it was all orientated around that. But before Bhakti Vinode Thakur actually moved there in around the end of the 18th century, there was the Oriental Institute in Calcutta was set up, and some of the greatest minds in England became part of that. One of the most famous is Sir William Jones. And another person who was part of that was Sir Charles Wilkins. Now, the interesting thing about Sir Charles Wilkins is that he's from the place where I'm staying now, Frome in Somerset. And in 1785, he completed the first English translation of Bhagavad Gita. And Bhagavad Gita is it's considered like the Hindu Bible. It's a section of a great itihasya, great history called the Mahabharata, which is a great story from India. Now, these chaps, up until then, I think a few Portuguese may have been studied. You actually, to enter into this literature, this knowledge, this information about what is behind this culture, what are all these temples, what are all these gods, what are all these different people doing? India is so diverse, and Sanatan Dharma, the types of spiritual practices were unfathomable to understand for the average Western mind. So it wasn't until these intellectuals like William Jones, he even became a vegetarian. He started to wear a dhoti. He lived in he had to gain the trust of some local people, some Brahmins. He was already one of the top Greek scholars. I think he was apparently fluent in many, many languages. He was a genius. And he cracked Sanskrit, you see. He learned Sanskrit. And so when these chaps, they entered into they discovered this whole world. They realize, my goodness, this culture is incredible. It surpasses even the Iliad and the Odyssey in terms of its breadth and depth. And then there's, apart from the stories, there are these incredible philosophical texts, the Upanishads and Vedanta. Now, this was happening during this period, the turn of the 18th century to the 19th century. Gradually, this knowledge started to seep into the West, gradually started to seep. You know, the English became sat in India. You know, there were many at the beginning, many British people got deeply involved with the culture, and then it went through a period, and then in the 19th century, there was they started to get much more racist and much more derogatory of the Indian culture. And it was following the moods, things that happened in India often following the moods of where everything was happening in Europe. And Funnily enough, an offshoot of the kind of the anti-slave trade was a kind of Christian missionary spirit where they all got on a big high horse, moral high horse, where they thought, actually, it's our moral duty and our right to go all over the world and educate these dark-skinned barbarians with their primitive thoughts and their strange ideas, and we're going to spread Christianity. But already in Europe and around, there were lots of intellectual people in the Age of Enlightenment, and people were very dissatisfied with mainstream Christianity and the dogma, and their eyes were opening to all sorts of different ideas. It's an incredible time. And not that I've studied all the great Western philosophers or all the Eastern, but I'm just giving you a kind of simple introduction. People like Schopenhauer around 1811 were already quoting influences from the Vedas, you know. Hermann Hesse, the great writer, his grandfather was in India, and he was translating books. He was one of the early translators of the Kerala Malayalam, the language down there. And there were people getting more and more involved and affectionate with the culture that was going on. And this developed basically through the 19th century. And then you even got to the point where many of you may have heard of a famous book, one of the first books, I think, written in English about chakras, kundalini, tantra. These are words that are kind of quite common now, and people, are quite aware, especially if you're involved with yoga and spirituality, and karma, all these words which are kind of like used by everybody. They started to kind of like come in around this period into a few people's ideas, and there's a few things that happen sociologically that kind of allowed this to happen. So John Woodruff, whose pen name was Arthur Avalon, he was one of these British people that actually had affection for Indian culture. He used to hold soirees at his house of Indian music. He was friendly with Indian artists, and he was had a lot of affinity for the Indian culture. Now, so there's a big jump from intellectuals and linguists who are studying texts because they're fascinated in just the language or the stories, but never in their wildest dreams, I don't think any of those would have thought that they would convert or even practice these the teachings that are coming from these countries. But by the end of the 19th century, there were a few people, Westerners, who were not just interested in the stories or the language of Sanskrit, they were actually interested in the spirituality. And this wasn't easy, because especially in India, they're the caste of Brahmins, who are the caste that are generally very learned and hereditary, well read in these ancient texts. They had all sorts of caste issues about even associating with foreigners, what to speak of actually sharing the esoteric knowledge. So that's what Sir John Woodruff did. Because of his love of Indian culture, he developed the trust of a Brahmin, and they sat together and they compiled together Serpent Power, one of the very first books. I've only looked at it. It's very, very technical. And you can see a picture of Sir John Woodruff in about 1880, 1890, standing in front of the Sun Temple, Konarak in Orissa, and he's dressed in a dhoti, basically. So this is an English, magistrate, starting to practice certain kind of tantric practices. So this is kind of, you could say, the beginning of kind of what's going to lead up to people like me, who are going to kind of adopt this kind of religion and some of the teachings from there in a very, very deep way. Now, I'm going to just talk about one person more before I go on and finish this talk for today, because I'm going to carry on tomorrow. One of the people, and it was interesting because not everybody knows this. I kind of assume that people know all the stuff that I'm interested in. But there was a lady who was from Russia, and she was known as Madame Blavatsky. And she created a kind of a movement called Theosophy, the Theosophical Society. And she came to India, And she wrote two very big famous books, Isis Unveiled and The Secret Doctrine. Now, I've been living in Glastonbury, which is in not far from here in Frome. And if you go to Glastonbury now, in 2020, you will find traces of practically everything that she was interested in, scattered in various forms in that town. And before that time, nobody had really kind of joined dots together. Now, whether this joining of dots that Madame Blavatsky created was accurate and a true portrayal of the nature of things is another question. The question is, she did it and she created this thing. And as I was saying earlier, Christianity, mainstream Christianity, amongst intellectuals and certain people, it wasn't satisfying for them. So, even undercover during kind of fanatical Christian regimes and the Inquisition, many practitioners of Kabbalah and similar types of things kept it very secret. And also, even in England, folk traditions and people that were into paganism, they kept it all very quiet during the kind of big kind of blanket Christianity, and all sorts of teachings and beliefs were kind of under the radar, so to speak, because basically people, it's very frightening to live in a society, as we can see today. People are very, very prejudiced and about groups. They think this, he thinks this, he's not one of us, he's one of them, or they are part of that. And if we look at history, it's full of groups of people who are minorities getting persecuted. So a lot of people kept their ideas quite quiet. So you've got practices like Kabbalah, which has its Jewish roots. You've got Rosicrucianism. You've got various forms of paganism and Druidism. And then you've got esoteric Freemasonry. And all these things were appearing in the 18th century, basically, and becoming more and more popular amongst intellectuals. And this kind of grew into the 18th century and what people called the Spiritist movement. It was a very, very, very big movement, especially amongst higher class Europeans. And into such scenarios came famous people that had a big influence on Russia and communism, people like Rasputin. They were all influenced by these things. Now, Madame Blavatsky, what she did was she joined the dots, not only between these Western mystery schools, but to Hinduism, Buddhism, and shamanism, and joining all this together, you see. So the influence of literatures like Madame Blavatsky can't be underestimated. And it had a huge influence, so that at the turn of the century, it came to the point where there was enough interest in the West for people to hear the actual spiritual messages that were coming from India. And I'm going to start my talk tomorrow and carry on from that point, and also then explain about I'm going to elaborate more on the spiritual Hare Krishna ripple effect, which gets involved with this, and the psychedelic ripple effect, which starts with an experiment with a very, very interesting scientist called Albert Hofmann in Sandoz Laboratories in Switzerland, where he kind of accidentally discovered LSD. That's going to be coming up in my talk tomorrow, or if not tomorrow, in a couple of days. I'll let you all know. Now I'm going to finalize my talk with a song, and I don't think I'm going to do a chant. I'm just going to do a song because time's going now. And I'm going to sing another song that Prana Me wrote. And it's all about, I've been talking about the past a lot, but really we're all actually right here now. And I wanted, one of the reasons for these talks and sharings that we're all doing is to take us out of all of this fear and focus on this kind of quite upsetting scenario we're all finding ourselves in. So I want to sing a song about now, the moment. Now, I've got artistic nature, and I know from my own personal experience that whenever I'm involved with a creative project, it could be cooking, could be writing, art, music, my hands are involved. Somehow or other in the creative process, I go into the moment naturally. and it's a fun, wonderful state to be in. Two famous books that have used this kind of idea have appeared in the 70s. A wonderful book was written by Ram Dass called Be Here Now. He'd just passed away, bless his soul. Sold millions, or a couple of million, and it influenced a lot of people, including myself. Be Here Now. I recommend you to read it. It's a great stepping stone. And more recently, we have more popular books like The Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle. So this song is kind of influenced. Pranaji was reading The Power of Now, and I came up with a composition. He came back from Germany after visiting his lovely friend Sissy, and we sat down. It was the quickest song I've ever read composed, and this is it. It's called The Only Way to Be. Excuse me. Okay, it's always a bit of a drag having to tune, but bear with me. Okay, I think we got it. Anyway, it's near there now. Do 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 do. Do 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 do. Do 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 do. Do 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 do. Do 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 do. Do do do. Do do do. Oh, how we try to change the world around us, missing the boat while waiting for the tide, lost to ourselves in fear and desperation, dreaming of a future while trapped inside a mind. As out of a dream, my life unfolds before me, sure to reveal what's been there all the while. Struggled so long to untie these ropes that bind me in a body of pain. I remain frozen in time. The future and the past are not within our grasp. Somewhere between the two, you'll find the real you, and what you'll find is love. that frees you from all pain. And with your inner light, your sight you will regain. There's nothing to compare to the joy of being there. This moment holds the key. We are eternity. Whoa, whoa, Future and the past are not within our grasp. Somewhere between the two, you'll find the real you. And what you'll find is love that frees you from all pain. And with your inner light, your sight you will regain. There's nothing to compare to the joy of being there. This moment holds the key. We are eternity. Whoa. Hari Om, Hari Om, Hari Om. Thank you again. It's been wonderful to share these songs and chants and to let me talk about the things I'm interested in. And I will look forward to sharing some more with you. And please, if you think this is interesting and you want to share it with other friends, please share the link. Many people will be watching other people who are performing now. My beautiful friend Mathura is doing a cast now, Madhavan Norton. If you go on Facebook, Darren will be doing his piece, meditation, shortly. And I will put a message up when I'm going to do my next talk. It might be tomorrow and it might be the next day after. But thank you very much. Hari Om, Hari Om, Hari Om. Om Shanti. And peace to all, because that's what we need at the moment in this world. A lot of people are in anxiety and fear, and we don't need that in our lives, really. So try and escape now and then into some way of getting into your own power, dipping into your spiritual nature, and just become equipoised and calm, and don't let this shit and all the stuff going on bring you down. Hari Om. Oh.